Good. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming to this panel tonight on the American Revolution and the left. We have a full panel with 4 panelists. I've heard basically all of these people speak before, so it should be a very good panel. Just, very briefly, this is a project dedicated to the reconstitution of emancipatory politics. I myself am not from Boston, but in your local chapters, like I'm coming from Philadelphia right now, we put on weekly reading groups, coffee breaks, as well as public forum. It can be anything from teach-ins, the interview that we just saw, as well as panels like we're going to see right now. I'm going to read the panel prompt first, just to give a little kind of outline of how the panel is going to go. We're going to have about 10 to 12 minutes of opening remarks. Then we'll have 3 to 5 minutes about responses, and then we can spend the rest of the time for Q&A. So to read the panel prompts before I introduce the panelists. How was the American Revolution revolutionary? Does the left today inherit any of the revolutionary tasks of 1776? Should the left break with or build on the legacy of the American Revolution? How should the left make sense of recent attempts to reject, reinterpret, or reclaim the revolutionary tradition of 1776? I'm going to read the bios in the order that the speakers are going to be speaking. We're just going to go from Ben down to Matei. So first, Benjamin Studebaker is a political theorist with a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Then to his right, to your left, is Tom Canel. Tom Canel is a union staff person with Share AFSCME. Usually it's AFSCME. Yeah, I didn't want to butcher that, so let somebody else say that. He grew up in England and was a member of the Labour Party Young Socialists as a teenager. Coming to the United States in 1979, he joined the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and was a founding member of the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982. Tom was one of a group of longtime members who resigned from DSA because of their response to the events of October 7th. To his right, to your left, is Daniel Lazare. Daniel Lazare is the author of The Frozen Republic, How the Constitution is Paralyzing Democracy. That's New York Hardcore Brace, 1996. And 2 other books dealing with constitutional policy. He has written for a wide variety of publications, including the London Review of Books and the New Left Review. He now writes regularly for the Democratic Constitution blog on Substack. And then finally, to your far left, my far right, this is Matei Alexandriu, is an organizer with the Socialist Party USA. He sits on the party's national committee and serves as a chair to the party local in southern New Hampshire. Matei also serves as secretary to the New Hampshire Congress of Workers' Organizations, of which Socialist Party of Southern New Hampshire is a constituent organization. The New Hampshire Congress of Workers' Organizations was founded in 2022 and comprises nearly all the socialist political parties chartered in New Hampshire, as well as several non-party organizations and independent community members from across the state. So we'll begin with Ben. You have 10, 12 minutes.
You want to sound on the ground or up?
On the ground, yeah. Okay.
For me, the central concept in the American Revolution is tyranny. Tyranny is an ancient concept. For Plato, the tyrant is the worst kind of person and the least happy. Tyrants arise when polities become thoroughly barbarized. The citizens cease to understand their connection to one another. They identify with the body and with the desires that arise from embodiment. They become uninterested in developing higher capacities, except insofar as those higher capacities can be put in the service of the bodily desires. This instrumentalization of the virtues has desocializing effects over time. It worsens the conditions for cooperation. This produces a crisis, a political and social breakdown, in which it becomes impossible for the city to rule itself. In its barbarized condition, it can only function underneath a master. But because the subjects in a tyranny are barbaric, they cannot be relied upon to serve the master. Indeed, they will kill him if they can. The fear of the subjects forces the master to become a tyrant, to use fear and terror to intimidate them. If the tyrant doesn't behave this way, the tyrant will be killed. This means that the tyrant isn't really free to run the city. Even the tyrant is enslaved by the fear that permeates every part of society, that dissolves social ties and isolates subjects from one another. In naming King George a tyrant, the American revolutionaries did not just accuse George of criminality, corruption, being a bad guy. They accused the entire British system of having devolved into something inhospitable. To oppose tyranny is to demand freedom, but more importantly, it is to demand the social and political conditions that make freedom possible. This is both a social and political issue. Tyranny happens because some non-tyrannical regime allows society to degrade to the point at which tyranny becomes necessary. At the same time, tyranny ends because there remains some part of society that, in spite of everything, organizes, not just against the tyrant, but against tyranny as a condition. Tyrannicide is only permissible when it overcomes tyranny. If it is merely murder, it is merely a further expression of tyranny as a form of regime. In practice, tyrant killers often struggle to tell the difference. Because tyranny occurs in barbarized circumstances, those who kill tyrants rarely have the prudence necessary to make the distinction in theory, much less in practice. The American Revolution did not kill King George, but it did overcome the tyranny that George personated. It created a new kind of polity that made a certain kind of freedom possible. This freedom was more ambitious than ancient freedom insofar as it was more inclusive. It sought to extend freedom not just to a landed aristocracy, but to laborers. But to extend freedom to laborers necessarily involves circumscribing it. It involves objective concessions. John Adams understood this problem. As Adams put it, he studied politics and war so that his descendants could study, among other things, commerce and agriculture. But that, in turn, was to create a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. To enjoy the highest freedom, it is necessary to pursue activities for their own sake, out of love, rather than out of fear of poverty or violent death. Politics protects against violence so that commerce can protect against poverty. But real freedom is freedom from fear and freedom to love. It is freedom from the activities that are about managing fear, war, and commerce. It is freedom to move in love in an intrinsic motivation unmediated by use or by necessity. It requires overcoming labor, overcoming the necessity of servicing the bodily desires. A freedom that identifies with the desires that arise from embodiment and with the labor that is undertaken to satisfy those desires is a regression. It was a regression for John Adams just as much as it was for Plato. But Adams and Plato recognized the necessity of regression. To get real freedom, you have to go through tyranny, through politics. You have to engage in activities that are not appropriate for a free person, that are not good, so that a better kind of freedom becomes possible at a later stage. To put this in completely different language without changing the meaning at all, you must step away from God, but always in his service. Adams was a Unitarian, you know. He believed in the one. Today in the United States, there is no recognized right to study the arts, to pursue anything for its own sake. If what you do doesn't generate money, you're a leech, you're scum. That's what the people outside think. We've become stuck in an inferior kind of freedom. This is not purely because people have misunderstood freedom or the good or God. We've become stuck for historical reasons. We will not get anywhere by simply arguing normatively for better understandings of abstract values. The American Revolution overcame one kind of tyranny, but it has become bound by a commercial logic that comes out of the structure of the world system. Since World War II, the American state has worked tirelessly to expand capital mobility, to make it easy to move money all over the world without fear that someone will steal it from you. This has been done in the name of freedom, the freedom to engage in trade. But the effect of this is that states and individuals are constantly having to compete for access to money. Money leaves if you try to tax it, or if you try to force the people who possess it to raise wages. Over time, the effect of this is to strip both governments and workers of their freedom. They are forced to do whatever commerce demands of them. You have to study whatever will get you a job. You have to study whatever will enable you to pay down student debt. You are more limited in what you can study than a person in the 1960s or 1970s was. You are, in that sense, less free than the boomer generation. And because you are less free, you live worse. You make more decisions based on fear. You become estranged from the love that resides dormant within you, the high kind of love that points beyond transactionality or sexuality, beyond pragmatism and eros, what the Greeks called agape. This process of stultification is beginning to make tyranny appear necessary. Perhaps it is. Perhaps we have lost the ability to pursue the better kinds of freedom and must rediscover it. But John Adams offered us another possibility, federalism. Through a federal republic, it becomes possible to qualify commercial competition, to set rules that limit the degree to which that competition determines our form of life. The purpose of federalism is not to subject everyone to a Bonapartist state. It is to use the political to qualify the commercial, so as to make space for the romantic and the spiritual. This is not to negate commerce. Commerce is necessary to reach a stage at which the romantic and the spiritual are universally available. Prior to commerce, there was war and politics alone. Politics was the mere management of war. The British Empire, through its mercantilism, put commerce at the service of politics understood in that old sense, at the service of war. Adams understood that it was necessary to put politics at the service of commerce, to make the world safe for trade. But that was a beginning rather than an end. Ultimately, politics must come back out from underneath commerce, not to restore the supremacy of war, but to enable us to move beyond fear itself. What we need is a new federalism, a federalism that can qualify commerce, that can make capital mobility a servant rather than a master. This is a project of overcoming the tyranny of the flows, of the commercial itself. There is no person or group of people that needs to be killed for this to happen. What is needed is a serious commitment on the part of young people, like many of you, to theorizing and constructing a new polity. This requires us to qualify our own freedom, to step away from the highest kinds of human activity and think in a practical, instrumental way, in a way that engages with our conditions, with necessity. But it also requires us to commit to this project, to something larger than ourselves, larger than our bodily desires, than our desires for recognition from others. Do we have these capacities? If we don't, we need to generate them. And that means creating new organizations that can provide the kinds of civic, social, and spiritual education that the commercialized universities exclude. If we can't even do that, what's left? We're so intimidated by the 20th century that we have lost faith in ourselves. Today, we do not even believe enough in human beings to want to personate tyranny. We are more comfortable with something faceless, with something that strikes us as impersonal, totalitarian, and Kafkaesque. We'd rather lampoon the absurdity of a bureaucratized administrative system than deal with real people, with human power. To give tyranny a face would, in this very narrow sense, be an advance. It would express a confidence in ourselves that we presently lack. But the goal is not to humanize tyranny. It is to go through it and get beyond it. This begins with an understanding that freedom is not our principal aim. If mere freedom is our end, then we can accept any old form of it. We have to be able to distinguish between higher and lower and better and worse kinds of freedom. And that means we need other concepts to think with. If we identify freedom with labor or with mere becoming, we forget how to evaluate it, how to judge between conceptualizations of it. We lose our impetus to struggle for higher kinds, instead naturalizing and reifying the lower. The Heideggerian tendency, the tendency to identify with the body, with being, and with becoming, has overrun the American project. It's extremely limiting. It comes out of a discrete material situation, a kind of middle capitalism in which technological development is substantial, but also far from adequate and far from what was anticipated in the 50s and 60s. In this interregnum, we are neither able to affirm labor nor able to eclipse it. And so we retreat into 1,000 varieties of existentialist bullshit in which we pretend we can transcend this situation ideationally or linguistically. The American revolutionaries didn't just have ideas. They weren't just special snowflakes with beautiful minds. They built things and put themselves in mortal peril. We need their courage, not just to fight for freedom, but to fight for love. It is not enough to demand freedom for all. We must build a world in which the highest kind of freedom is possible for all. The freedom to love unpragmatically. It is only when animated by this kind of love that we can say with Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin that rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
Okay. As an aspiring teenage Marxist in 1970s Britain, I was taught that while the American Revolution of 1776 was progressive in its time, a time when the establishment of capitalism as the dominant mode of production would still be an important step forward historically, the American Revolution's progressive impact was now largely spent. The American Revolution had been a bourgeois revolution, we were told, and since the bourgeoisie had since passed the revolutionary baton on to the proletariat, the American Revolution was now kind of passé. The relative disdain for the American Revolution did not seem to extend to all ostensibly bourgeois revolutions. The allegedly equally bourgeois French Revolution was still celebrated and was seen as a source of inspiration for revolutionaries, even those of a fundamentally proletarian caste. Now, this differentiation in reaction to the French and American revolutions was not peculiar to British Marxists in the late 1970s. There's somewhere between liberal and conservative political theorist Hannah Arendt, whom Panelist members read in last summer's reading group, complains about this disparity in reaction to the two revolutions. She felt nonplussed that the American Revolution, which she deemed profoundly successful at establishing political freedom, was often treated with a ho-hum reaction, while the French Revolution, which he deemed a dismal failure to establish freedom, was widely lionized. Part of this disparity was attributed by Arendt to the different aspirational scope of the two revolutions. The Americans, Arendt claimed, limited themselves to establish a realm of political freedom within society, being largely unconcerned whether the population as a whole could participate in the political sphere or how broadly they experienced poverty and economic lack. It is precisely her supporting rejection of any aspiration to broad social emancipation that precluded Arendt from becoming a socialist. A socialist, to the extent that they agree with Arendt about the circumscribed scope of the American Revolution, will naturally tend to get more excited about its French counterpart, but did attempt a broader social emancipation, at least ostensibly. The interest of the Platypus Society in resurrecting the American Revolution as a source of inspiration for Marxists does have predecessors on the American left, though. My first example of this is the Communist Party USA during the Popular Front era. In the early 1940s, the international communist movement came to the conclusion, let's say 1930s, I don't say 1930s. In the early 1930s, the international communist movement came to the conclusion that its previous, quote, class against class politics, unquote, had enabled the accession to power of Nazism in Germany, and the continuation of these politics would not help fight fascism globally. As a result, national communist parties were instructed to build broad progressive coalitions, popular fronts, in their own countries. As an aid to this, the national communist parties were to celebrate the progressive traditions of their respective countries. In the US, this took the form of the party claiming that, quote, communism is 20th century Americanism, unquote. And on one occasion, its youth wing, the Young Communist League, boasted that it celebrated 1776 much more assiduously than organizations of the right, such as the Daughters of the American Revolution. Particularly since the Cold War and the New Left engendered, anti-imperialism has been seen as opposition to American imperialism in particular. Any celebration, therefore, of the American heritage, including the Revolution of 1776, became anathema to much of the left. One marketing advantage that the American Revolution had over its French counterpart is that the American Revolution is not associated in our imaginations with the revolutionary terror the way the French Revolution is. The Platypus Society fervently avows that the transition to socialism, dictatorship of the proletariat, would not involve terror, repression, or the denial of anybody's democratic rights. Therefore, it is natural for Platypus to endorse the legacy of 1776. For better or worse, though, Platypus's perspective regarding revolutionary terror seems contradicted by the content of Frederick Engels' article on authority from 1872. He writes, quote, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, authoritarian means, if such there be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionaries," unquote. I want to argue that if a Marxist does see the American Revolution as an inspiration for the left, they must decide that Engels was wrong on this occasion concerning the need for such an expansive, overt threat of violence. What the French would call my political master, founder of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and then one of the first DSA co-chairs, will be my second example of American leftists celebrating 1776. Michael Harrington, although a left anti-communist, was still a supporter of the Popular Front strategy. Like the CPUSA during their Popular Front period, he saw an emancipatory content to the American Revolution. For whatever reasons, and historians can be cynical about this, the Declaration of Independence substituted for property rights references to the pursuit of happiness. For Harrington and others, the Declaration thereby opens up space for arguing that if particular property relations become a fetter upon the general pursuit of happiness, it is right to challenge those property relations. It is through buttressing challenges to predominant property relations in this way that the legacy of 1776 could potentially be a resource for the left today. Platypus makes the argument, and if I got this wrong, I'm sure that people will correct me very rapidly. Platypus makes the argument, I claim, that socialism must take the form of a reaffirmation of the bourgeois right to ownership over one's own labor. This is a right for which the 17th century English philosopher John Locke famously argued. So it is precisely in the ways that it was inspired by John Locke's philosophical arguments invoking bourgeois property rights and labor, but the American Revolution should be a resource for socialists today, according to Platypus. However, rather than having a socialist potential, Locke's discourse can become a justification for capitalism, if only a before-the-fact one. In the second treatise on government, where Locke affirms the right to one's own labor, Locke argues that it violates nobody's rights for someone to hire someone else as an employee. Locke also explicitly endorses the right of an employer to appropriate the fruits of and therefore to make a profit from their employees' labor. The individual unlimited accumulation of non-perishable wealth is also endorsed by Locke. To conclude, I claim there were two souls driving the creation of the American Republic. One, a soul committed to enabling the general pursuit of happiness, which is embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And two, a soul committed to the affirmation of Lockean property rights, which is embodied most explicitly in the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution. I admit that most of the American revolutionaries of the late 18th century would have seen this as a distinction without a difference. But from our viewpoint, within advanced capitalism, we should, I claim, make a point of this distinction. My third example of socialists lionizing 1776, American socialist icon Eugene Debs, made, I argue, a similar kind of argument in his Independence Day address of 1901. He argued that the founders of the Constitution saw equality as being just for themselves, rich property owners, and thereby felt able to legitimize slavery, for example, while the Declaration of Independence, according to Debs, was imbued with the genius of free institutions. Thank you very much.
Is this on?
Is it on?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, let me state my position very clearly. I am a rejectionist, anti-Arendtian, anti-popular front view. I hear that kind of rejection of the U.S. The American Revolution. And let me begin by saying that America is a very complicated and very mysterious place. It seems very simple on the surface. The Constitution, original only 4,000 words, which seems to lay out with crystal clarity how American society works. But when you penetrate beneath the surface, it gets a lot more complicated. So I want to explore now some of the paradoxes and contradictions of the U.S. Revolution, American Revolution. And I just also want to just introduce a book here. I don't know if anyone is aware of, familiar with the historian Robert R. Palmer. He's best known for a book called 12 Who Ruled, written in 1940, a study of the French Revolution. In 1959 to 1964, he published a 2-volume study called The Age of the Democratic Revolution, which I think is one of the great achievements of American historiography. And Palmer is kind of my guide. When I first read Palmer, I was just amazed at how well he understood this period. So I want to begin by discussing 3 revolutions. One which broke out in 1787 in Belgium. Another which broke out in France, Paris in 1789. And then the third, circling back, the American Revolution, which broke out in 1775, 1776. The Belgian Revolution is least known, but in some ways it's extremely relevant to the American Revolution. Belgium was a federation, roughly the same population as America in 1776, 2.3 million people. It was ruled by the Austrian Habsburgs, and it had a constitution dating back to the late Middle Ages. And when I say a constitution, what I mean is an accepted way of running society. And it was extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily time-worn. Society was run through dozens of myriad interlocking institutions, monasteries, guilds, the bishoprics. There were tariffs everywhere. There was a whole late medieval maze. And in 1787, the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II, who was in Vienna, who was probably the model of an enlightened despot, said, "This is crazy. We're going to modernize Belgium. We're going to sweep away all these ancient medieval structures, and we're going to impose a very simple, very egalitarian, and very efficient form of government." So he did that. And the result was a revolution. Belgians rose up in arms in defense of their ancient institutions. And there actually was major fighting, and they prevailed at one point, but in 1790 they were ultimately crushed because they split into 2 different parts, and then they were then conquered by the Austrians. But the point was the revolution was a revolution against the Enlightenment. It was the model of a conservative revolution that was fought in defense of the ancien regime, the existing form of government, which the Belgians saw as the freest form of government possible, and which they were determined to hold on to. And the Belgians, by the way, actually even formed a United States of Belgium. That's what it was called in 1788. So that revolution was crushed. So then you go forward 2 years to the events in Paris. And actually the events in Paris were preceded around the same time as the Belgian Revolution by a similar conservative revolt by the nobility against the attempts by Charles Calon, the finance minister of Louis the 16th, to solve the taxation problem, to essentially fix the very old, very ancient, very time-honored taxation system to render it fair. Because the old system fell mainly on the third estate, the commoners. And Calon's reforms also engendered a revolt. Not in 1789, in 1787, a revolt by the conservative nobility, which actually drew a fair amount of popular support. And then that revolt essentially was crushed. But then 2 years later, a very different revolt arose, one made by the Third Estate. And whereas the Belgian and the French nobles had risen in defense of the ancien regime, the French Revolution in 1789 essentially went to war against the ancien regime. And the French Revolution was a great modernizing revolution because its aim was to sweep away all the medieval appurtenances and replace it with something that was very streamlined, efficient, and modern. So we have two revolutions, one anti-ancien regime and the other pro-ancien regime. So which category does the American Revolution fall into? Now, clearly follows the Belgian model much more closely. America in the 18th century was the freest, wealthiest, and most democratic place for white American males on earth. And Americans had a very high degree of self-government, democratic self-government, extending back into the 17th century. And as far as they were concerned, that was a heritage worth defending. Now, the British, who were also modernizers, trying to put the empire on a more modern footing, after the 7 Years' War, decided to reorganize the finances and to try to impose taxes on the Americans the same way that Calon had tried to impose new taxes on the French. And the Americans' objection to the stamp tax was not merely that it had been imposed by Parliament without consulting them, but their objection was that it was new, it was novel, it broke with tradition, because never before had Britain ever imposed a direct tax on Americans. And they saw that as an attack on their ancient liberties. So the American Revolution is much closer to the conservative Belgian Constitution and to the conservative 1787 revolt of the nobles in France than it was to what followed in France in 1789. So that suggests that the American Revolution was a reactionary revolt. However, this is where it gets complicated. Because America was the freest, most democratic place on the face of the earth prior to 1775, it was a conservative revolt it was in defense of the highest level of democracy existing on earth to date. So it was both conservative and democratic, but its concept of democracy was thoroughly conservative in that it saw liberty as ancient, pre-existent, primordial, something that Americans had gained by virtue, merely by virtue of moving to the New World. It believed that change was almost always tyrannical and injurious to liberty. And the result, among other things, was the US Constitution, which did make great concessions to the need for some kind of semi-quasi-centralized modern nation state, but which still essentially tried to codify existing liberties that had existed since time immemorial. The First Amendment, the Second Amendment, for example, is the perfect example of that, where the right to bear arms is seen as a central pillar of liberty, and therefore the right to bear arms must not be disturbed. So when we deal with America, we are dealing with a country whose revolutionary heritage, paradoxically, is a conservative one, which I think explains a great deal of our society today, and which essentially really can't conceive of a modern socialist concept of democracy, which of course flows from the French revolutionary concept, despite what Hannah Arendt said. And I also want to point out that America eventually did have its second Jacobin stage of the revolution, but that happened in 1861 to 65, where essentially Lincoln carried out a Jacobin program in which he crushed states' rights, he centralized power in a new, far more powerful nation state. He imposed an industrial program of the sort, by the way, the Jacobins had imposed in the 1790s. That, to a certain extent, did bring America into the modern age, although it did not really, get rid of that awesome conservative heritage altogether. Sure. And Tom, you said that platypus rejects revolutionary terrorism. The best estimates are the revolutionary terror in France may have claimed 250,000 lives. That was roughly one person out of 100. France had a population of 28 million. The second stage of the American Revolution, the Civil War, claimed somewhere around 750,000 lives. That was roughly one person in 35. So the America's Jacobin Revolution was roughly 3 times as terroristic as the French Revolution was. And even then, that was far less successful in propelling the US into the modern age than the French Revolution was. I think the French Revolution is a starting point for any kind of modern socialist politics. I think that the American Revolution has got to be approached very cautiously, very critically, and has got to be seen as a product of the pre-modern era. The question is whether America is the last ancien regime left in the modern world, the advanced capitalist world.
So I hadn't prepared anything before as an opener. Maybe that was my mistake, but what I'll do is just take a couple minutes to discuss how I approach the American Revolution and its legacy from a Marxist perspective. So the opening question on the prompt was 1776 revolutionary?
And I'll disagree with my friend here that it was a reactionary revolt. I will agree that their demands did constitute the preservation of an existing system or the pulling back of the wheel of time to return to that set of institutions. But I would say that they were comparatively more democratic and represented a much more open level of public participation in politics than a monarchy would have allowed for. So I will go ahead and say that even if they were calling back in time to a form of organization in response to the monarchy, that it did still amount to something revolutionary. But in terms of the enduring revolutionary legacy of the American Revolution, I'm constantly faced with how to contend with it as a Marxist while keeping my Marxism intact. And the way I've arrived at is that if we think about the history of that era of revolutions, I'll just stick with 1776 and with the French Revolution, is that a lot of the inspiration of the demands on the French Revolution were inspired by the demands of the American Revolution, and it would be difficult for one of these very definitely revolutionary movements to be taking such an incredible amount of inspiration from a non-revolutionary movement. So when I think about the legacy of 1776 from a Marxist perspective, I have to square the circle that the American Revolution and its ideas eventually produced the French Revolution and its ideals. And from that French revolutionary tradition, we got French socialism, and out of French socialism, we got Marxism. So I can draw a continuous line from the American revolutionary tradition to the Marxist revolutionary tradition that I'm operating on today. And I'm able, maybe rightly or wrongly, to do that without contradiction. At least I feel like that is a smooth marriage of those perspectives. So I would go ahead and say that, yeah, sure, for its time, the American Revolution was perfectly revolutionary by comparison to a monarchy. Then in terms of, it's at this point in the conversation that I think a lot of American socialists are, they start to lose themselves in the legacy of that revolution. It's very easy for us to look at the revolutionary period as one where the people involved with it were thoroughly committed to freedom, and then somewhere along the line we lost that spirit, and it gave way to a corporate takeover that now dominates our country. I don't think that that is remotely correct as an interpretation of American history. And I only have to go as far as the Federalist Papers to understand that what we would today describe as a corporate governing mentality existed just as explicitly in the first generations of this country. We can go to the Federalist Papers and we can find James Madison talking about how the source of political factioning is inequality of property, but rather than address the need to equalize people's access to property, he takes the perspective that the state plays the role of mediating whatever conflicts pop up as a result of that inequality. So you have that. You have an explicit defense of inequality, and an inequality that will be mediated and preserved by the government they were making. And then on the other hand, you have Alexander Hamilton here, there, and all over the place describing that contemporary project as a commercial republic. And it happens several times throughout the extensive letters between the three people writing the Federalist Papers. So from the offset, the goals of the American Revolution did have a scope that saw beyond the rights of monarchy, but it channeled its new rights directly into the hands of its capitalist elements, and it did that from the start, and it did so explicitly. So what should socialists learn from 1776 is that there is no Marxism that doesn't eventually draw its lineage back to that revolution, and we should appreciate that. But we should also understand that for however revolutionary it was at the time, it is incompatible with a working class revolution. It is perfectly good for studying history and studying the dynamics of revolutionary movements, The Constitution may very well be seen as an accomplishment to many who have an opportunity to examine it. But at the same time, and I said this in the panel or the discussion that I was in before this, the Constitution that was the result of the American Revolution, it paid credence, it gave respect to someone's right to life, but it had no such respect for the material bases of life. You are entitled to the right to life, but you are not, by this government, entitled to the right to things that keep you alive. Your food, your shelter, your transportation, your communication, your healthcare, all of these things are not provided for, being they are things that sustain and enable life. And while you do have the right to that life, all of those necessary elements you're on your own for. So we have to understand that, yes, there is definitely a lineage that starts from the American Revolution that goes directly up to revolutionary socialism. But if we're going to take the additional step and say that the American Revolution from the start did constitute something that was much more revolutionary than it was, that was somehow dramatically less capitalist in its origin than it was, we would be venturing into a history, and we wouldn't be doing ourselves any favors in our efforts to build a revolutionary movement today. And if we were to have I won't call it a revolutionary movement, but if we were to have a movement that came up in defense of the Constitution, as opposed to some other set of rights that were more extensive and more universal, that would be reactionary. Like you said, there was a point in time where this evolution from monarchy to a commercial republic did expand the amount of people who could freely take part in the political process. But capitalism and the capitalist republic has maxed out on the number of people that it's willing to include in that process. And to make equal rights an actual thing and a universal thing, the capitalist republic, the liberal republic of today, cannot and will not accommodate those needs. It will not address those tasks in any serious manner. So as a Marxist, I will go ahead and I will say that yes, in 1776, the American Revolution and the constitutional order that it produced were comparatively revolutionary to the forces they contended against. Nowadays, they are quite easily determinable as the rights of capital, just arranged in a neat document. They have nothing to do with universal rights. They have nothing to do with a true democracy. It has commercial democracy in mind, and it delivers on that very well. But today, we have to look at the revolutionary legacy as something to overcome, even if we are going to learn a thing or two from it. But that the liberal ideology, the constitutional order that exists today as a result of it, they are quite explicitly dedicated to this partial democracy where there is a group of people who are freely able to participate in the political process and a much larger group of people who have no real access to it, even if their rights to it are explained in a document. So if we are going to build a revolutionary movement today, we have to understand that it is going to have to be opposed to the existing constitutional order, opposed to the existing liberal ideology, and opposed to the existing liberal republic. We cannot work with them. They do not want to work with us. We must build our own new world.
Okay, so now we're going to be in the response portion. So just 3 to 5 minutes, just to kind of respond to the other panelists' responses.
Yeah, I notice a lot of focus on the internal mechanisms of the United States, its constitution, its internal political role. The biggest problem with the United States is that it's not large enough. It's federalism in one country. So it can't govern capital mobility. You can putz around with the constitutional rules in all kinds of ways. It doesn't solve the central problem that we face, which is that money goes all over the world whenever you try to confront it in any way. And I think that that is something that really hasn't come up today at all, the global character of this. It's not something that can be done with good national institutions of any kind. It's not something that can be done just by having national leaders that are good people or socialists or have right view or right thing. It's a problem of the structure of the entire supranational system. And to change that, we would need a kind of federalism that is capable of expanding and which people in other parts of the world want to be part of. The kind of federalism we currently have, in part because of the legacy of the 20th century, the legacy of the Cold War, the way that this state has carried on and behaved in the world, doesn't have the legitimacy to expand. It lost interest in expanding more than 100 years ago, really. It has been very, very bad about expanding for a very long time. So it can't just be an expansion of this federal system. And it also can't be just chucking out one kind of national democracy with another kind of national democracy, one kind of republic with some other kind of republic. That's not going to do it. We need to construct something supranational that people all around the world would actually be able to join us in doing. And I think we're very far away from even beginning to get serious about that. And the stuff about constitutional amendments and whether there's a Senate, this the property rules in the Constitution, none of this grasps any of it.
Ben, I really appreciated your remarks. I felt as though they kind of were a concretization of the possible politics that, like, the pursuit of happiness would involve in this particular context. And so I was reminded that I thought there was Aristotelian ideas of what happiness is could be invoked. I was also reminded of I very much like a philosopher who's very much not a Marxist, called Stanley Cavell. And he has this idea that the American philosophy is one of moral perfectionism, which isn't as judgy as it sounds. But it's more that basically that we can become people who are freer and enjoy richer forms of happiness and basically and are able to develop richer lives. And it seems to me that very much fits into what you are articulating as well. And the thing that strikes me is these people all want to be Marxists. And are we taking them away from Marxism? Does anything that what we were saying, does that correspond to a Marxist politics and a Marxist philosophy, a philosophical reaction to current reality? And if so, what does that mean for Marxism? And I think that Matei, I think that Matei articulated really well and very clearly the exact position that I was taught as a teenager in Britain. It's what I take to be the Marxist position. And the question then comes is, well, why is Platypus, a Marxist organization, becoming interested in the American Revolution? And it's partly presumably because Marxism, as it has been defined, is seen as being, if not dead, in a very fundamental crisis. And what is the basis of that crisis? Well, I got this book out of a bookstore. It's Dominic Lazzare's Screen in Western Marxism, which in some ways is a very frustrating book, and in some ways is a really fascinating book. And he makes a distinction between Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism. And it seems to me that you can define that both Western Marxism and Eastern Marxism, as they're defined here, are result from the conscious refusal of the revolutionary of the working class in the West to aspire to revolutionary proletarian subjectivity. And so Western Marxists sort of respond to that by retreating into reflection and into historical reconsideration, et cetera, et cetera. Eastern Marxists, like Losordo, respond to it by supporting the colonized masses and mercantilist states, anti-imperialist states that are opposing the American empire. And what is common to both Eastern Marxism and Western Marxism is a recognition that the Western proletariat is not going to live up to, it refuses to live up to the role demanded of them by Marxists. And that, I would argue that that is why people are supposed to basically look back to previous revolutions, like the American and the French, and we can't just carry on with the old Marxist discourse. And on a completely different note, and finish off, sort of, Dan, the kind of history you gave us, like, I found very convincing, and I'm sure that the Palmer book is going to be really, really convincing. This morning, James Vaughan gave a brilliant and very convincing account of a similar period in history. And I don't know how the hell I'm supposed to tell who is right. And for me, and I think sort of like I haven't talked about the actual American Revolution because I don't really know that much about it. But what I do know something about is how the left has received the American Revolution, and that's maybe more history is myth than history is reality. And I'm wondering what the relative importance of those two are. I'm sorry, I went on too long.
Okay, first of all, Matei, is this on? Yeah. Okay. Matei, the American Revolution inspired the French Revolution. Yes, to a degree, but the French Revolution quickly, rapidly eclipsed the American Revolution. And the Americanists in France, by the way, were immediately, within months, found themselves on the defensive and were essentially shut out of the political process. The radical elements were actually very dismissive of America, and they really left the American example far behind. The Declaration of Independence got a lot of play in Europe. The US Constitution was really almost completely ignored. It had very little influence on events there. That was ratified in 1787 to 88. The idea of a continuous line, I mean, I don't think you really understand. I mean, the American Revolution, the Americans were more democratic than George III, but more conservative. That's the important point. They were more backward looking, less modern, more democratic, yes, but also less modern. That was the essential thing, and that made them diametrically opposed to the French Revolution. So there is no continuous line. That is completely untrue. The French Revolution breaks off history. Everything before the French Revolution is pre-modern. Everything after the French Revolution is modern. The American Revolution falls on the first side, the far side of that line. And it's that, so there is no smooth marriage, to use your term. And the question about the capitalist elements, yes, there were capitalist elements in America in the 1780s, but the planter elements were much more powerful. And it was the planter elements who initially benefited from the American Revolution. By the way, I was taken aback, Ben, you quoted John Adams about the necessity for freedom for laborers. How about the slaves? The American Revolution strengthened slavery. It surrounded it by numerous impregnable legal defenses, which is why the Americans had to fight a bloody civil war with 750 million casualties in an attempt, an extra constitutional attempt, to rip slavery out by its roots. But this document of freedom actually served the opposite purpose. Internationalism or an international federation, the international project is called revolutionary socialism. The aim is a revolutionary socialist republic. I think American federalism is terrible. I think it's absolutely just an astonishingly unwieldy wasteful, undemocratic construct. And the idea of extending to the world, I mean, fills me with utter horror. And your dismissal of criticism of the universe of the U.S. Senate as somehow irrelevant. I'm sorry. The U.S. Senate is one of the most unrepresentative bodies in the so-called democratic world. It is an astonishingly at variance with any modern concept of democracy. 54% of the country lives in just 10 states who were outvoted 4-1 by the minority in the other 4. I mean, this is a filibuster can be garnered from senators representing just 11% of the U.S. population. This is a fantastic affront to democracy, and to somehow call it irrelevant is astonishing. Over to you, Matei.
We have a very fascinating mosaic of agreements and disagreements. It's very interesting. So I'll just go down the line. I'm curious about our friend at the end of the table, Ben. This was just sticking out in my mind the whole time. Like, what's the 51st state going to be? I don't know. I'm in agreement with Dan here that the idea of expanding the American Republic into other parts of the world, unless I'm really misinterpreting your position, but to use our friend's words, horrifies me. The other thing that stuck out is the supposed alleged death of Marxism that I do struggle to see in the world. I will definitely admit that global socialism took a big hit at the end of the 20th century, but I wouldn't say that at all that Marxism is dead. I'd say Marxism breathes life every day, that there are American socialists contending together about how to build a revolution. There are Marxists in that who are attempting to leave a mark on that movement, and corpses do not enter battle. So Marxism must still be alive. In terms of the what you were saying, Dan, I would just wonder what is the definitive factor for reaction? Is it time or is it policy? Because you can look back in, like, if we wanted to go ahead and use the metric of time, then democracy itself is a reaction. We're not the Athenians first to the punch on this one. If we're going back all the way to them, then we are reacting a whole lot. So I would make the argument that it is the nature of the policy, the fraction of people that are introduced into political participation that makes a movement reactionary or revolutionary. Because again, we can't stop going back in time for ideas. We continually go back to Athenian and Roman republicanism. We continually go back to different revolutionary movements that have provided us with fodder for thought and wondered how to reincorporate them properly into a new movement. So I would go ahead and say that the deciding factor for how we determine something to be revolutionary or reactionary should be the nature of the policy and not necessarily its epoch of origin. In terms of the class struggle that did come out, and this is why I said we have such an interesting mosaic of agreements and disagreements, because I do definitely believe that the constitutional order did go far out of its way to protect slavery. And what I've told the people that I talk about this with is that the American Revolution, it certainly did sweep away monarchy, and it did bring about, like Marx describes, a new environment of antagonisms. And the antagonism of that time was slavery and capital. Like once we have gotten through the struggle between the monarchists and the Republicans, the remaining struggle was the struggle between capital and between slavery, which developed and culminated with the Civil War. And now that struggle concluded in favor of capital, and the new struggle is the working class and the capitalist class. There was a lot about your historical clarification that I do in fact agree with. The Constitution didn't get much play in France. The Declaration of Independence was definitely the centerpiece of American inspiration, and I totally agree with you there. But yeah, I would wrap things up responding by just saying that at the end of the day, a democratic movement is always going to be more, it can't possibly be more reactionary than a monarchist movement. And so I would have to go ahead and say that the American Revolution is certainly revolutionary instead of reactionary, but I would make sure that no one thinks that I believe that the American Revolution actually undid the environment of antagonism rather than refacing its topography. I think that played out.
Just one quick rejoinder, if I may. The American Revolution did strengthen democracy. It also provided for 20 more years more of the kidnapping of thousands of Africans and their transportation to America. So the American Constitution essentially allowed the slave trade guaranteed will continue for another 20 years. Now, how is that democratic?
Well, how many French republics were perfectly okay with continuing to colonize Algeria without saying that
But the French Revolution outlawed slavery in all French possessions in 1794. In 1794, the French Revolution abolished slavery in all French possessions around the world, including in the West Indies. Now, that is democratic. The American Revolution allowed the kidnapping of Africans to continue for another 20 years. That is not democratic.
Can I ask a really ignorant question? So it's not
Me?
no. It doesn't get my time. It's an ignorant question. So I thought I'd been told that the American Constitution was actually very ambiguous about slavery. That on the one hand, it codified it, like that stuff about fraction of people counting towards the population for voting, so which is a clear legitimation of the institution. But I thought there was also something in there that basically opened up space to abolishing it eventually. So I thought there was a sort of ambiguity. And is it? I don't know much about history.
You're partly right. There was it's legally entrenched slavery, so it required a massive civil war to remove it. But what the American Revolution did, what the Constitution did, is it created an arena for national debate, and that meant that that anti-slave elements in the North suddenly had national impact. That didn't exist before the Constitution. So in a sense, the Constitution strengthened slavery and strengthened anti-slavery, which is why the moment it was ratified, it made inevitable civil war some 70 years later.
Okay, so we're gonna go to Q&A, but believe it or not, I'm gonna abuse the moderator privilege because I also now am inspired by all these opening remarks. And I feel like when we've been talking about 1776, we focused on maybe more the political side of the revolution, meaning it's been compared to kind of, the history of literally the act of the French Revolution, right? Sans-culottes, plebeian elements, storming the Bastille and everything like that. And I was wondering what the panelists thought in terms of how maybe the American Revolution lives on in civil society, in terms of, I think, Dan, you referenced actually like a Stamp Act and all sorts of self-governance that seem to be infringed upon. The famous phrase would be, taxation without representation, something like that. But I feel like the emphasis has been on that the American Revolution, whether or not it was good or bad, did not seem to be democratic enough, like political enough. And I was reminded of something that Matei mentioned in his interview, the 18th Brumaire, the first sentence of it, once as a tragedy, then as a farce, that Marx is, of course, talking about the history of the French Revolution. And so, the first French Revolution did fall on democratic excesses, but then seems to be achieved in some peculiar way in 1848 on the same democracy. So I was wondering maybe if the panelists could take up how they see the American Revolution living on in civil society, as opposed to just kind of a comparison of political models of revolution. Like, do you take a French Revolution, or do you go with the American Revolution?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Americans always had a very conservative but highly developed form of civil society. I mean, 50 to 80% of white males could vote in colonial America. The equivalent figure in Britain was like around 5%. So the Americans, white men, we had great capacity for self-organizing, for politics, on a purely local and in a very conservative way. The Constitution did open things up so that politics now had national scope, so that people in Massachusetts could now criticize what was happening in Virginia rather than just merely what was happening in the next town. So that was vitally important. That, of course, raised politics to a whole new level. But these kind of popular politics were very highly developed in America, which was was its great strength. But as I said before, they were conceived of in a very traditionalist, conservative way. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Say one. Or Matei? Sorry, apparently I did. Oh, okay.
I didn't know I wanted
Did I say that?
Yeah, say something. Okay.
And I think in terms of sort of civil society, whenever somebody encounters the word civil society, I think that there's an implicit discussion about the administrative state coming on. And so I think that one way in which the American Revolution has been invoked is in populist responses and resistance to what is seen as a more encroaching administrative state, Trumpism is very much connected to that. I think that it's sort of complicated because I think that the notion of pursuit of happiness, there are certain ways in which I believe that the administrative state can absolutely enhance the pursuit of happiness. I believe that universal healthcare enhances the pursuit of happiness. I believe that unemployment benefits enhance the pursuit of happiness. So I'm nothing but a Democrat, and I do believe so. I think there are real problems with the administrative state, and one needs to democratize it and humanize it. But it needs to be seen as a potential instrument for enabling the pursuit of happiness, as well as a potential threat.
I would just say very quickly that I wrote about some of these things in the Platypus Review, in the Beyond Bonapartism piece, and in Sublation, in the critique of the administrative state. So I would just point people to that and let somebody else ask another question.
Hi. Yeah, I think my question is maybe related to Danny's, which is about the relationship between our views on the American Revolution and the task of building a mass workers' movement for socialism, ostensibly in the US as a kind of vanguard for an international one. Because it seems to me like the kind of disavowal of the American Revolution on the panel seems to be more or less a fringe opinion that I hear essentially on, within woke academia and within the kind of anti-liberal left, which obviously is quite fringe. So how do you get from that revision to that revisionist view of history to organizing a kind of mass workers movement when most American workers wouldn't care, have any kind of sense of what you're talking about, and frankly would be quite offended probably, and should sort of like shut off from the possibility of being organized in a mass sense.
Go first.
No, I mean, the battle today, American democracy is in ruins. I mean, it's this country is in a state of advance of extreme crisis. I mean, the Senate is a marvel of anti-democracy. The House is gerrymandered. The Electoral College gives lily white Wyomingites nearly four times as much clout in presidential elections as majority Californians. This is an atrocity. America is almost flamboyant undemocratic. And any mass workers movement must contend with that. It's got to be anti-constitutional. The Constitution also, by the way, makes it impossible to change the Constitution. So the first task of a workers' movement is to change the unchangeable, and that's what revolution means. The law says you can't change so much as a comma in this document, because essentially the amending process is completely hopeless. So essentially, the workers' movement has got to smash through that barrier and democratize in a revolutionary manner this pre-modern structure, this ancien regime. And of course, that kind of revolutionary democratization carries over directly into socialization, because the only force capable of doing that is the working class. Certainly not the middle class, not the bourgeoisie. Obviously, bourgeoisie benefits from this. So it's only the proletariat which has the strength and the desire to smash through these barriers, and they have got to be smashed. They can't be. There's no easy way out, and there's going to be a direct confrontation. That is revolutionary.
I just wanted to focus on the part of your question where you talk about bringing our ideology out to the uninitiated and attempting to organize them along an ideology that they are trained to not accept. I think we've been contending for the last 50 years about how to bring socialist ideas to the working class and have the working class accept those ideas. And we have tried to be progressive Democrats. We've tried to be socialists who don't talk about socialism. And we still have an amazingly large section of the working class that can certainly grapple with how capitalism presents obstacles with them, but cannot yet be brought to embrace socialism yet. And my thought at this point, and has been for some time, is that it's not that we are not skillfully enough hiding our socialism, it's that we're not being as full-throated about it as we ought to be. Nobody follows timidity. Nobody is ever going to follow someone who is not prepared to take full responsibility for their worldview. I won't. If you are unafraid to tell me what you believe in, get out of my face. I have no time for you. But if you are going to go out into the world and say that you are a socialist, you have no shame in being a socialist, and you are prepared to explain fully why you are and others should be as well, you'll have a lot more luck initiating the uninitiated and persuading people than if you just try to, approach them in such a way that absolves you of the need to challenge them at all. So we've had this task ahead of ourselves of how do we take an American public that is primed against socialism and how do we make it more friendly to them? But we've been playing a fool's errand thinking that by being less socialist or only being socialist in secret that we can unlock the socialist hidden within the hearts of every American. Like, that's just not how people work, and it's certainly not how Americans work. Americans love boldness. Americans love people who say what they mean and mean what they say. So if I'm going to lie to you about being a socialist just in the hopes that I trick you into becoming a socialist, I'm not doing anyone a goddamn favor.
So Benjamin Constant differentiated between ancient liberty and the freedom of the moderns. So for Daniel Lazare, I'm wondering if you considered this differentiation. In fact, he used it to criticize the French Revolution for being overly invested in an ancient idea of freedom rather than a modern idea of freedom, which was concerned with the freedom of society, right, rather than the modernization of the state. Matei, you also referenced, I think, ancient Greek democracy, and Ben, if I'm not mistaken, you spoken to the idea of being a Platonist Marxist in the past. Maybe I'm getting that wrong, but be interested in hearing your thoughts.
Okay, so which part of it is for me?
I think the question was primarily.
It was primarily directed at.
Yeah, I'll respond to what they say about the Greeks.
Yeah.
So this is a critique which says the French Revolution is too backward looking.
Essentially,
To be taken with the Greek model.
essentially,
I mean, yes, the classical models were very important, but there's no doubt the French Revolution conceived of democracy very differently. I mean, I just was reading Hegel today about in ancient Greece there was only freedom for a few, whereas in the modern world there's freedom for everybody. But there's no doubt the French Revolution took this ancient idea and, of course, was drawn to it. It was attracted to it. You can see David's paintings about the death of Socrates to show how this heritage was. But they drove through that very rapidly and created something that was far more radical, far more modern, quite breathtaking. The American, whereas the American U.S. Constitution strengthened states' rights, one of the first acts of the National Assembly in France was to break up provinces and turn them into uniform départements, and that filled Edmund with absolute horror. That's probably the most horrifying thing he saw in the French Revolution, but the American Revolution was based on traditional concepts of the British Constitution, which was based on ancient liberties, ancient rights, the rights of Anglo-Saxons, etc. And these two world outlooks are very much opposed. And one revolution was fought around one idea, and the other one was really devoted to the other idea, which makes them very different.
Did anybody want to say anything else? Briefly.
Yeah, so what I want to say about this is that there's a tendency to essentialize about the French Revolution, essentialize about the American Revolution, essentialize about ancient liberty, modern liberty, about what the Greeks believed, about Greek democracy. In all of these periods, there was an enormous amount of disagreement about core concepts, about whether those concepts were good or bad, about how they could best be conceptualized. The reason there's so much conflict in the French Revolution is that the French revolutionaries themselves disagree about how the core French revolutionary concept should be undertaken politically. So when we describe a French Revolution as opposed to an American Revolution, we set up a binary between these two things. This is a stylized argument to try to shift people toward a particular view that you have, but it has nothing really to do with history. If we were to really want to dig into what is the French Revolution, we would have to talk about CA, who nobody's mentioned at all today. We would have to talk about the Jacobins. We would have to talk about the Girondins. We would have to go through that in a detailed way and discuss the real disagreements and real conflicts people had. Multiple kinds of people, all of whom identifying with modernity in various ways, nonetheless having very sharp differences of opinion about how concepts should be taken up. And the same, of course, can and must be said for the Greeks. Plato does not identify freedom with democracy. Quite the contrary, for him, democracy is the road to tyranny. It's the road to total loss of freedom by everyone, a kind of alienated form of rule enjoyed by no one at all, which is a really fascinating idea. But of course, you would have other Greeks who would understand freedom in terms of democracy. There are reasons eminently in each of these contexts and periods for why these different views came up. And to really properly discuss all of those, we would have to deal with each of them on their own terms in a historically rooted way. So I think to some degree, one of our problems is that there's a tendency to stylize years and go, what does 1776 mean? What does 1917 mean? And what does 1848 mean? Well, these years mean lots of different things to different people. And to really get into that, you'd have to spend more time with it than we're going to be able to spend here. And that's why I think we should keep our focus on the American Revolution rather than make binary comparisons with French.
Quickly.
Yes, that's completely incorrect. There was no the partial limited exception of Alexandriu Hamilton, there was no one in America, not one, literally, who understood democracy as a forward-moving revolutionary movement. There is not a single, you can go from Georgia to Maine, you would not find a single person. That idea was invented by the French.
Why do you think democracy is the central concept?
The French Revolution was so revolutionary that it revolutionized the concept of revolution. And that didn't happen in America in 1776. This is the crucial point.
Democracy is not the central concept in the French Revolution.
Of course it is.
We're gonna do a French Revolution panel.
It would be more
30 years later. So we have a question. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so I suppose my question is more or less directed at the entire panel. Although it'll be pretty obvious with whom I agree most. What would you all say to the idea that, like, in addition to the American Revolution not being a revolution, in fact, being more or less a baronial revolt of landholders and slave drivers, that all notions of American liberty, freedom, and democracy are themselves consecrated in the expropriated labor and expropriated land of indigenous peoples and Africans? There is no American concept of liberty or democracy without those being intrinsically part. They were excluded from the constitutional order when it was written on purpose. There are literally laws on the books from back then saying, oh, we will treat these native nations as equals. No, they won't. By their own lights, they do not lead their revolution. And there is no separating that to me. So I guess, would you say that there is some form of American liberty that isn't tied up with the Jeffersonian yeoman idea of no white man being compelled by any other white man? But other than that, freedom and democracy don't exist because everyone else is property. And the primary right enshrined in the American Constitution is the right over property, not anything else. And I guess also on the note of you can reinterpret the pursuit of happiness, I don't think you can. Trying to renegotiate what we think the pursuit of happiness means is pointless when rather you can simply institute a new constitution that guarantees those rights to food, shelter, safety, education, employment, all of those things. So is there a concept of American liberty that exists outside of that? Because I don't think so.
Okay. I kind of 2/3 agree with you, 1/3 don't. Yes, there was a baronial aspect to the revolt. The Virginia legislature in 1779 announced that people who joined the militia would receive a bounty consisting of 40 acres of land and 1 slave. As I said before, the Constitution did strengthen slavery, but it also strengthened anti-slavery, and the 1780s saw a very, very powerful push to outlaw slavery in the northern states, and that was very, very important. Samuel Johnson's famous quip, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps of liberty from the drivers of Negroes? That actually stung very deeply, and the revolutionary period saw all this debate saying, like, no, how can we declare liberty for ourselves while keeping humanity in chains? So there was a genuine democratic aspect of the revolution. There was also a baronial aspect of the revolution, which is why a civil war had to be fought. But my point is the democratic aspect, even that was very conservative, and in many ways was the opposite of what we would see in France 12 years later, roughly. Oh, and that's it. Going down the line.
I think that the whole conception of American liberty, the whole conception of American pursuit of happiness, all of these things are fundamentally contested. If you go to, like, we went to see the Liberty Bell, my family, a couple of years ago. I can't remember the names, but one of the things that they have an exhibit, and the head of the head of the Confederate States has a quote saying like how the Liberty Bell inspired their fight for their basic rights to own slaves. Right next to it, there's a quote from some leading abolitionists about how the Liberty Bell and the Declaration of Independence basically was the toxin that started the whole struggle against slavery and for abolition of freedom. So, it's all bloody contested. And everything sort of like we get upset when people say that freedom is a right-wing word. Well, freedom is a right-wing word if the right is able to take it. It's a left-wing word if the left is able to take it and inflect it with leftist meaning. And I think that is profoundly true of the American heritage in general. I think we could be talking a lot about the 18th Brumaire. That's the one where sort of like man makes his own history, but not in the circumstances of his own choosing. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So part of the circumstances are the cultural symbolic life world in which we are placed. And the American Revolution and the heritage and the cultural and political heritage of America is part of that context. So we have to, if we want to make history, we have to make it in that context. And I think that means struggling over the meaning of what the pursuit of happiness is, what individual freedom is. Sort of, I think with respect to native rights, we have to basically affirm that basically it is a historic fact there was a genocide. There's a historical fact that there's an expropriation, and that is part of contradictory history, and to basically redeem the principles of American the American people's pursuit of happiness. That oppression and that history has to be addressed politically. I think it's all contested.
Yeah, I would just say that it has to be understood that freedom came into the human world of concepts very much as a zero-sum idea. Your time and your energy, where you can make poetry and sing and write plays and come up with beautiful philosophical ideas and paint and sculpt, it comes because someone else gathers food for you and you make them do that, and they have to do it. And if they don't do it, you beat them. That was how freedom began in this world. So we have been struggling over time to make freedom not based on that kind of zero-sum domination. That's an ongoing struggle that we've been engaged in since the first person got the idea, why do I have to gather food for myself? I'm big and strong. Why don't you go do it for me? That impulse to dominate nonetheless gave rise to all of the things that we're able to do, including all of us sit here and talk for any length of time. All of our activity is ultimately grounded on slavery, domination, and exploitation. And this is true in the United States. It's true in every capitalist system. It's true in every socialist system, which is still based on labor, and some people doing certain kinds of labor and other people not. It's also the case in all of these traditional empires, ancient states, many, many tribal societies as well involve these kinds of dynamics. So this is an ongoing process to try to find ways to extend the benefits of freedom to more and more people without watering down what it means. And the trouble is that we are so appalled rightfully by the domination and exploitation and horrible abuse that occurs that we try to extend it in ways that involve watering it down. And so we end up in conditions where lots of people have an inferior kind of freedom, but it's not really the case that you can do what a Greek aristocrat did. Our struggle is to get to a point where every person can live like that without the domination and without the oppressor-oppressed dynamics that come out of that. It's an ongoing struggle. No period in history can be redeemed from this accusation. No people, no human being, we all, every single one of us, benefit from domination and exploitation. And this has been true at every point. At every point. It's terrible, and yet we have to struggle to overcome it.
There's another question on the audience.
I think Matei wanted to say
Oh,
that.
Matei wanted to- okay.
Yeah, I'll just say that the unfortunate fact is that all of American history is contextualized in slavery or genocide, so there's very little about its political realities or conditions that isn't somehow tarnished by one of those things. Even our Constitution is tarnished by that history. And it's a shame that that is the history that we are bound to inherit and have to improve upon. The only thing that kind of that I have to remind myself is that throughout the country's history of clearing natives from their land and stealing it, and throughout the history of enslaving Africans and having them do our work, and throughout all of the history of injustice, there has always been people in this country who are ready and willing to fight against it and are very often using the recognition of the rights that some people get to live by, and the disparity in that others don't get to enjoy them has always been operative in this country. And there's always been people here who are disgusted by the history that they inherit and the country that they are living under. But there were always people who were organizing and working against slavery. And there's a reason why the country eventually had a civil war that ended slavery instead of becoming a country where it was ubiquitous and uncontested. And I don't want anything that I'm saying about this to be taken as an endorsement of the American political legacy. I mean, it's dog breath, but I just have to contend with the fact that throughout all of these instances of state barbarism, there has always been a section of this country's citizenry that understand how evil it is and have put themselves sometimes at mortal expense against that. So I'm an American by law, not by birth. So I am continually treading a line between trying to place myself within American society while also trying to understand its sources of ill and its evils. But I always end up coming back to the fact that we are a country that is dominated by evil interests that are full of good people who would love to undo those interests. And so to put a cap on it, unfortunately, there is no aspect of American life that isn't tarnished by the legacy of colonialism and slavery, but there have always been people who have been ready to put themselves up to fight it, and people are still fighting the lingering institutions of inequality today. And we should be proud of that. It's not because our government has encouraged us to do them. It's not because our government allows us to do them. They are often the primary obstacle. And a lot of, I'll speak for myself. I do my best to understand that the American Revolution has a legacy that I can learn from, but I know that I would make a mistake to go the additional step and defend that legacy full-throatedly. I can take lessons from it worth taking, but at no point I hope should anybody interpret my willingness to approach a complicated question with the necessary complication as a failure to properly censure its evils.
It's a question, when do we have the room till? 6:50?
As long as we want.
Okay, so I have 4 questions down, so go ahead, I just want to.
I just wanted to say that I take great exception to the statement that we all benefit from slavery. The proletariat does not benefit from slavery. The nature of the proletariat is intrinsically, fundamentally hostile to slavery. That is the basis for socialism, it's a force which will topple slavery.
How did we get here?
Okay.
So that's a long, that's quite a long answer.
So we have a question here, and then I'm gonna
my comrade has allowed me to, just a second to rebut real quick. Sorry, and I'll be done really fast. Just on the notion that American freedom is a contested notion, the American legacy is a contested notion. And I know this might be rich coming from me personally, but it's only a contested notion for white people. And to be a native or to be an African descended person, American freedom has never been anything but a lie. And I don't think that has been addressed more appropriately. That's all.
I think that both Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass might disagree with you.
Sure, but
I'll try to keep the preface to my questions brief. Firstly, Dan, I pretty much agree with everything that you've been saying this whole time. I must break with my comrade Matei on the question of whether or not the American Revolution can be characterized as revolutionary as such. Although I still think that the spirit of the argument is captured in essence. But and also, I think that the pursuit to reify these concepts of the pursuit of happiness or freedom, I think that process is dubious in itself. I think that there's no value there. If we really want to look to any group of people, any revolutionary movement, and in terms of what informs our current practice, it would be 1917. That said, Dan, you seem to be very familiar with pre-American Revolutionary history in terms of how America was organized. And I'm familiar with, the colonial charter system and all these things, but you keep speaking to the idea that America, prior to the revolution, had already become essentially the most democratic nation on earth. So I was wondering if you could speak more to that in terms of what that meant practically, how that was organized practically. And then Ben, I must say, quite frankly, I'm not impressed. You've been speaking a lot of vagary, and particularly with the question of the federalization of the world. I really don't know what you mean. If you could explain what you mean in practical terms. Thank you.
I'll go first, then Ben. First of all, we're talking about white males, by the way. And also, by the way, white females had a very high level of freedom in America compared to Britain, for example. But land was abundant. There was plenty. The standard of living was extraordinarily high by British standards. As I said before, the 50 to 80% of white men had the vote. In Britain, the equivalent figure is like roughly 1 in 15 or 1 in 20. So by any standard, it was extraordinarily free. There was no aristocracy. Well, there was a quasi-aristocracy in the South. I should really amend that. But in the Middle Atlantic states and New England, there was no aristocracy at all. And even the Southern planters, the grandest of them, were middling people by British standards. So that was a very high level of democracy. But the way it was perceived in environmental terms. It was a gift conferred by the New World. And by moving to the New World, Americans had become free. And therefore, their task was to conserve those freedoms. And we see this around us constantly. This is still part of American political discourse. I mean, we conserve our freedoms. The famous story of Benjamin Franklin. He was accosted by some woman in the street after the Constitutional Convention and says, what have you given us, a republic or a monarchy? His answer was a republic, if you can keep it. So Americans think of freedom, of rights, as things to conserve. And that's the great power behind the Second Amendment movement. Somehow the right to bear arms is traditional, it goes way back, therefore it must be conserved because it's part of this ancient structure. And therefore we must keep it. But this is a pre-modern argument, and it's a pre-democratic argument in the modern understanding of the term.
Yeah, so the Soviet Union is also a federation, right? Because the Soviet Union was not able to expand and become a global entity, it was not able to ultimately control global flows of capital. Its market size was insufficiently large, and it began to stagnate as a consequence of this, right? So with the exception of some Stalinists who defend socialism in one country, most people recognize that once it became clear that the Soviet Union was going to stagnate territorially, that at that point it was not going to be able to fulfill the socialist vision, which was a global supranational republic, federal republic, that could control capital flows around the world, right? And say to money, no, you have to do this because we, the people, say it must be done. And there's nowhere you can take the money and run. You've got to do it because we say it's important, right? You can't do that when you have just one territory. Now, the same is also true for the American Revolution. As long as the American Revolution is territorially bound, it will not be able to govern global capital mobility. Instead, the United States will be governed by that force. But because we're the most powerful state in the system and we're wealthy and we think of ourselves as the people who are in charge, we don't recognize that our government is overdetermined by the system of global capital flows. It is itself trapped and barbarized and made small by the fact that it's subject to those flows. So for all of the same reasons that you would defend the Soviet Union, you should also defend the United States. These are both federal republics that failed to expand, and because they failed to expand, they regressed.
But the United States is not a proletarian dictatorship, and never has been.
Neither was the Soviet Union.
Well,
Yes, it was.
that's
It was.
I can disagree with you. on that.
Third panel.
Yo, okay, so I came in a bit late. I think it was the gentleman in the gray sweater at the end of the table. Yeah, nice to meet you. You said that the American Revolution was more revolutionary than reactionary, right? I don't see that. I feel like the American Revolution, all it did was upheld liberties that the colonies already enjoyed and were infringed upon by the British. And that was a natural reaction to British overreach. It wasn't really a restructuring of society because we had the same like social bound structures. It was, you could say it was maybe a political like revolution, but it really wasn't, because the American Constitution itself was like partly based on the Magna Carta and like British legislation that already existed. So I just changed my mind.
I'll do my damnedest. Like I said before, whether we look at the American Revolution as an effort to create new rights, which it evidently was not, or an effort to conserve existing rights, which were seen at the time to be in danger, I think we've cleared that one up. This was an effort to preserve an existing set of rights that wouldn't have been able to flourish under a much more direct monarchical rule. So I'll go ahead and say that yes, that the American Revolution did constitute an act of conservation with respect to the rights that that made up their list of demands. But I will go ahead and reiterate what I had said before. I think what makes something revolutionary or reactionary depends on what percentage of the people it actually intends on bringing into political participation. I think if you are going back in time to find a social mode that was more open to a wider group of the people and being involved freely in politics, then it doesn't matter that it's backwards in time. It has expanded the number of people taking part in decision making. So that, like I said, I've already kind of departed from the the temporal measuring stick. It is not time that makes something revolutionary or reactionary. It is it is whether the pool of political participants is growing or shrinking. So by virtue of that, I would make the argument that by conserving those freedoms into the American Republic, that those were revolutionary efforts. They may not have been revolutionary efforts resulting in new institutions protecting new rights. They may very well have just been new institutions protecting old rights. But those old rights did in fact translate to a larger number of people taking part in politics and its decision-making than had it been a simple democracy, or a monarchy, I'm sorry. So I'm going to stick to my guns on the argument that this was predominantly a revolution. It's not my fault that it wasn't the revolution that we wanted, and I can say that. But the fact of the matter is that I do think that the American Revolution did constitute an attempt to keep a comparatively wider level of political participation. And that's as far as I'm going to take it. If I go any further, I'm going to start to inappropriately ascribe credit to things about the American Republic that I simply don't approve of, but that's my answer. Right?
Let's go to a question, perhaps.
I have a question. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
So this first one is for Daniel. What if we just said the bourgeois revolution? Because I tend to see the French and the American revolutions together, but you don't have to, and you don't clearly. But I was just wondering about what is the legacy then of the bourgeois revolution for the left? And I have one more question to Matei, which was, you said in the context of defending the American Revolution, very cautiously, that how you might do that, wondering how you might do that while keeping your Marxism intact. But why? Like, why keep your Marxism intact if, like you said, it's not even useful in terms of organizing?
Okay, so, the question of bourgeois revolution. But the classic, France is the classic bourgeois revolution. And the Jacobins had a bourgeois program based on industrialization, urbanization, an industrial plan, or the government taking charge of industrialization. And also conferring rights and duties upon all citizens, etc. The American Revolution, the capitalism was a small element in America in the 1770s. It was very underdeveloped. There was no industry, there was some small industrial stirrings, but not very much. The wealth was in the hands of the planters, who were the sort of homegrown aristocrats whose wealth was based on slaves, and they were very wealthy. The American industrialization really only followed the revolution by about somewhere 20, 30, or 40 years. So you can say the American Revolution laid the basis for that capitalist explosion. But it really wasn't quite a bourgeois revolution in the same sense that the French Revolution was. And I think that I think Marxists have got to look very critically upon the French Revolution as well, because the heirs of the Jacobins by 1848 were actually very conservative, so we've got to be very critical towards that episode. And evaluate it very carefully, and be aware of the class nature of that episode, and realize it doesn't just sort of slide effortlessly into socialism. But we've also got to be, with regard to America, we've got to be aware of the great contradictions and ironies that are associated with the American Revolution, which in some ways is actually more complicated than the French Revolution. And America carries these forward. But populism is a huge force. Government is failing. We've got Donald Trump, and I think that America has got to confront this heritage, and so far is failing to do so. Anyway.
Yeah, and I also want to kind of broaden the boundaries of the discussion. We've been kind of juxtaposing the American Revolution in 1776 with the French Revolution in 1789. And my heart doesn't truly lie with either of them. I'm a fanboy for the Paris Commune. I love that shit. I go for that big time. 1789 is cool and stuff, but I write home about the Paris Commune. That's what I want to tell my people about. But you guys can enjoy 1789. I'm not going to stop you. It's a beautiful time, whatever. But to your question about defending the American Revolution while keeping my Marxism intact, what I mean by that is that I want to be able to examine the history of the American Revolution and derive anything of value that can be derived by way of a dialectical and materialist investigation. So if I can go through the history of America, learning what there is to learn while analyzing it through the lens of dialectics and materialism, then I will have successfully learned something useful from American history while keeping my Marxism intact.
I wanted to ask, what are the stakes of these differing interpretations of the American Revolution? Because there are several ways you could take that, and I'm not sure how clear it is. Right, like, are we having a kind of arid historical dispute, which will kind of enrage and excite scholars? Are we disputing advertising or recruiting tactics for various political parties? Like, maybe if you say the American Revolution is bad, Americans won't join your party. Maybe if you say it's bad, they will join your party because they hate America. Are we attempting to discipline and understand our sentiments? Like, we should recognize like good or evil, maybe in the experience of the American Revolution? Or are we, as Matei, you just suggested something like this, is there something that we're learning theoretically in our appraisal of the American Revolution? Right? There are a number of different ways this could be taken. And just to pose this in a different way, part of why we're having this panel, at least in my estimation, is that we have an election coming up in which the American Revolution is commonly reconsidered during American revolutions. Or sorry, excuse me, elections. That's a good slip. And I guess, is there anything important? Are the stakes of our interpretation of the American Revolution, should they be any different as socialists or leftists? Is there anything special in the way we should think about the American Revolution? Is there anything different, in us saying the American Revolution was a bad slaveholders rebellion or something like that? Are we different from the Democrats who might say something like that? Or if we want to defend the American Revolution as ushering in liberty or something like this, are we any different from Donald Trump who might say something like that, right? Do we have those interpretations for different reasons? Or are the stakes different for us?
Well, I'd say from the leftist perspective, no one should just be defending the American Revolution. And I've chosen my words very carefully with that too. I study the history and see what from it I can divine that is of any value. And if I can do that, keeping a dialectical materialist outlook intact, great, then I've done what I sought out to do. In terms of what all of the consequences of these different interpretations might possibly be, if these conversations about the legacy of the American Revolution are not parlayed into a conversation about how to build a workers' republic, then we are neck deep in sophistry. We are not doing anything useful. We are having a conversation that has no consequences, and so there are no consequences to these differences in interpretation. So until we actually start to introduce into the conversation, how do we learn from the legacy of the American Revolution such that we can build a truly democratic workers' republic? It doesn't matter. You're all just patting yourselves on the back with very well studied historical, you have your history down pat and we all know it. That's great. Fantastic. But if we're not actually putting that study to use for our revolution today to build a new workers' republic, then none of it matters. The most well-constructed opinion on the American Revolution does not matter if that conversation doesn't end in how do we build the workers' republic.
So your question concerns the problematic implications of this debate. Is that correct? I think that it's actually highly relevant. First of all, any workers' revolution must be internationalist. And internationalism means breaking free of narrow national traditions. And if you somehow see the American Revolution as somehow a framework for socialism in any way, in any respect, then that sort of implies that you are operating within an American ideological framework, a national framework, rather than an internationalist framework. An internationalist framework is one which is highly critical of all national traditions, but first and foremost of one's own. And it means essentially dissecting the American Revolution in the most objective manner, but also in the most unsparing manner, and pointing out all aspects of it that were reactionary and backward, and essentially declaring war on that concept of Americanism. The American Revolution is very much bound up with race. And, of course, various people will celebrate the revolution and try to gloss over that fact. But, but as you said, the American Revolution actually wound up strengthening racism in many important respects. And we know that racism and slavery expanded, and racism grew more and more ferocious throughout the entire post-revolutionary period. In other parts of the country, there was an effort to fight against this, very limited, but eventually it led to a civil war, which was one of the great human crusades in history. So I think that this debate has great implications. I mean, Trotsky in his work on the permanent revolution, discussed all those aspects of Russian development that were peculiar to Russia, which he argued had great, implications for the very revolutionary struggle. That had to do with the subservience of the Russian church, the scattered, pre-economic nature of the peasantry, etc. So he actually went way back in Russian history and tried to sort of show the problems that were posed by Russian history and to deal with them in as objective, scientific, but ruthless a manner as possible. And I think that American revolutionaries must do the same thing. They must grapple head on with this so-called revolutionary past, discuss what was revolutionary about it, what was not revolutionary, and to demand a complete revamp, root and branch of American politics, American political understanding, American institutions. That is what a revolution means.
I think that when we talk about the political stakes of anything historical, we're talking about history as myth. Now, history can only work as a myth if it hides the fact that it's myth. And therefore, like in generating the particular myth that we want to do, we have to make sure that it can sort of stand the critique of historians that inconveniently happen to want to buy. And so I think that I'm writing like two quotes. Hopefully there are some English majors in the house. Did Alexandriu write America's never been America to me? Yes. So I think that's a very powerful, poignant poem and statement. And the question is that fact is clearly morally unacceptable. And the question is, how do you respond to that fact that America has never been America, Langston Hughes? Do you destroy America, or do you try and redeem America so that it actually can be America for Langston Hughes? And I think that to some extent that's the political stakes of this discussion about 1776. In deference to Matei's membership of the Socialist Party USA, I am reminded, of course, of Norman Thomas. And Norman Thomas at an early anti-Vietnam War rally, famously, and Harrington used to quote him all the time about this, said, "We have come here not to burn the American flag, but to cleanse it." And those are two very different affective political orientations. And I think the choice of which one we take is the political stakes of what we're discussing today.
Yeah, I would say I'm not here to affirm or negate the American Revolution, particular things that happen, particular moments. I'm here for tarrying with. So to see both the potentials created by something, but also the various ways in which it falls short necessarily. All human endeavors include both possibilities, potentialities, and they include very bad aspects. And I think we oftentimes in our society today spend too much time deciding whether we like or don't like something, or whether we identify with or against something. The American Revolution is not to be liked or disliked or affirmed or negated. We are in it. It's here. We have to do something in it. And the question is what is possible within it, and also what are the problems of it? And is it possible for us to do anything about those problems? So what I've tried to do here is draw your attention to some of the problems I see. They may not be the problems you see. You may see other problems. But I've tried to draw your attention on the premise that you can all think, and you all have something to contribute in terms of thinking about these problems. Maybe not every single one of you, but hopefully a lot of you, right? Hopefully more in this room than maybe in the general population. Maybe. I'd like to think. And for that reason, I'm not just trying to shove a particular narrative or a particular view down your throat and make you agree with me on all of the salient points. You know, if you want, if you have different views about it, it's important that you develop your own thinking as a theorist. That we do theory, not just read it and then try to beat people over the head with it.
My question is actually kind of in the spirit of Ben's last remarks, because I had the same sort of response to the conversation that the American Revolution isn't an opinion one can agree or disagree with. It's a fact of history that's in fact reshaped the world and continues to do so, and does so around the world, actually, all the time, right? So for instance, JFK saw the American Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. There were American flags at Tiananmen Square. Ecuador is on the dollar. I could go on. The list is quite long. But any revolution that happens today in the world, and really for the last 100 years, thinks of itself in its relationship to the American Revolution. And part of the reason, that we're talking about the revolution, the American Revolution, the way we are, is because of the failure of the 1917 revolution, which came up. Namely, that the American Revolution seems to criticize the failure of the 1917 revolution, and that revolutions around the world today reach for the American Revolution, and they don't reach in the same way for Lenin, or at least in as much as the socialist revolution, as Marxism allied itself or liquidated itself into collectivism against American individualism, it has definitively lost. So that, I think, is a question that we have to ask ourselves. To what extent does the American Revolution criticize the failure of the struggle for socialism? What's its relationship to the necessity of the struggle for socialism? And what does it mean that capitalism will be revolutionized today, in the future, on the basis of the American Revolution? How does a socialist or someone who wants the socialist revolution orient themselves towards that as regards to the American Revolution?
I don't know if I see the situation the same way as you do. There are plenty of movements that have made use of American imagery and that hold the American Revolution as its ideal much more highly than the Russian Revolution or something else. I would simply say that those movements that the general public in this country are actively made aware of are certainly those ones that place the American Revolution in this country and its mode of government as an ideal. There are, however, plenty of movements that have no interest in the American symbolism, legacy. You will not find anybody in Palestine right now who is waving an American flag. You will not find anybody in Kerala in India who is waving an American flag. You will not find anybody who is fighting People's War in the Philippines flying an American flag.
To oppose America, even if they don't embrace America, don't they feel the need to say, I denounce America? And isn't that an orientation towards America?
I'd say that's the opposite of that. I'd say if you're renouncing them, you're certainly not taking them for an example. You're certainly not placing them as a source of inspiration. You're claiming them as an enemy. You're claiming them as an opponent. So I would say that There are many revolutionary movements that are taking place right now, whether it's in India, whether it's in the West Bank and Gaza, whether it is in the Philippines, or Venezuela even. Like, you won't find anybody waving American flags there either. At least none who are not, committed to the destruction of the socialist projects there. But I think it is your perception that America and its revolution are held in such high esteem on such a wide basis, but I unfortunately do not think that your perception is accurate.
Well, first of all, 5 million Venezuelans have left for America. So, and they have not left because they're all right wing. They're left because the economy has absolutely cratered.
That's going to be the next panel.
Anyway, I mean, Aaron, the America has led the anti-communist crusade since 1919, and certainly since 1945. And yes, the Soviet Union collapsed disgracefully in 1991. So 1917 doesn't quite have the same punch that it might have had in the 1930s. That's undeniably true. Some people do sort of celebrate America as a land of individual rights. They look towards American liberalism as a source of hope and freedom. But American liberalism is doing very poorly. Maybe Kamala will win. But certainly America, to much of the world, connotes means Donald Trump. It means that crazy right-wing conspiracy theories. It means an increasingly aggressive foreign policy. And the idea that somehow the American Revolution can be used to overthrow American capitalism and usher in socialism. I mean, this to me this makes no sense at all. And I mean, any socialist movement must confront the American political heritage in all its complexity, but must do so in absolutely as rigorous, unsparing, unsentimental, and revolutionary manner as possible. I don't mean to set crude stereotypes, but I mean being very sophisticated, very scholarly, very careful. But still, you've got to dissect this beast and show how it has turned into the global imperial hegemon that it is.
I mean, I think Aaron was saying, like, you should shake your head vigorously when I get this wrong, but like, the world is amazingly affected on America. And so that can be like negatively or positively, but like, I remember about sort of 10 or 15 years ago, like there was very strong nationalist anti-American feeling in China. And at the same time, the NBA was incredibly popular and everybody was wearing NBA shirts. All my leftist friends back home in England are completely obsessed with American culture. And denounce it, but at the same time, sort of like, they're so into Black Lives Matter. The European left gets a lot of its ideas from America. Now, you guys aren't going to like that because a lot of those are around identity politics. But the left is and at the same time it goes all anti-American. So there is a profound cathexis on America within the world. And I think that's why, and I think we have a profound cathexis, either negatively or positively, about American history. And I think it's also almost a sort of like a psychodynamic thing. I mean, sort of like, and this question was psychodynamics, it sort of feeds into politics, or you can't have, or politics is determined by psychodynamics. We have to work out what our libidinal attachment is to the American Revolution, just because we're here and we're in this flow of symbols.
I would say that any kind of socialism that can govern capital mobility must include the core states, the richest and most powerful states, which will in capitalism by definition be the states associated with oppression. This is a very difficult problem to solve. These states will have been the states that have committed the greatest atrocities to the developing states. And yet if the developing states do not include ultimately the core within their socialist project, they will not be able to be successful. So any kind of successful socialism must somehow find a way to reconcile the core with socialism. That doesn't mean that we should do it hastily or pretend that we've achieved it when we've not. This will be, if it can be done, an incredibly fraught process for all of the reasons that have been discussed. But also, I think one of the things that people have been doing lately is retreating into a kind of third worldism, where it's suggested that socialism can happen without the richest and most powerful states, this kind of second worldism, which was tried after 1917 by the Stalinists and did not work. And not only did it not work, it produced an enormous catastrophe which discredited socialism in the core. And this is, the Lazare book. These things are complementary. The attempt to do socialism in the periphery without the core produces a reaction against socialism in the core. And these things feed each other. Brixy second worldism feeds opposition to socialism in the core. And of course, conversely, opposition to socialism in the core leads people to think that they need to look for a second state or second system. Ultimately, socialism will not be achieved by pitting systems against each other. There has to be some kind of possibility of talking across this. But for all the reasons that you've seen tonight, that possibility seems very remote at this stage, unfortunately.
So just real quick. Yes, I totally agree. I'm against those third worldist revolutionary theories also. And the advanced, the proletariat of the advanced capitalist world is the revolutionary force. But it's not the American state, the bourgeois state, that will make revolution or make socialism. It's the American proletariat, which will take part in the movement and perhaps lead it by overthrowing the American bourgeois state. So it's not a question of the American bourgeois state is hopelessly reactionary and must be overthrown. Anyway.
I have a question. Thank you, Already for this presentation. I have a question about Ben and Dan about the relationship of your talks to liberalism. Ben, I may not have fully comprehended your talks, you can correct me, but there's sort of a detected a kind of platonic element there, which I worry at least might fall beneath liberalism, which is to say, there are these higher ends of life that the political community should be oriented towards. Whereas liberalism suggests you can benefit from social cooperation with one another without sharing the higher ends of life. So you can pursue your higher consciousness, I can be involved in my rugby, this worldly concerns, but we can still benefit from social interaction, social exchange, etc. And I'm just wondering, what is the relationship of what you call kind of platonic Marxism to liberalism? And Dan, similarly, I'm going to point out something radical Republicans pointed out at the time of the Civil War, which is you could enfranchise all the enslaved people in South Carolina, and they would be re-enslaved by the majority of South Carolinians. So clearly, there's something more going on than democracy. So I want you to address the question of liberalism because, as Lincoln points out in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, I mean, if you take Douglas's position to its logical absurdity, just give everybody democracy and if they vote minorities into slavery, they vote minorities into slavery. So clearly the problem is not just the issue of democracy. There's something more profound and deep going on. It's simply the question of democracy that can't possibly be the solution. So I wanted you to address the question of liberalism. And also, it's just a historiographic concern. You had raised the book of Palmer, R.L. Palmer. And of course, he famously says in the introduction to that book that he wrote this book because he was worried about a developing dualism of the Cold War, in which there were conservative capitalist American historians insisting there was this American Revolution that was conservative, that had nothing to do with the French Revolution. And there were these official communist historians who said there was this good French Revolution that was truly radical and wanted nothing to do with the American Revolution. And you found the book very convincing, but you clearly didn't find the point he said he wanted to write it convincing, which is to destroy precisely these kinds of dualistic approach to the American French Revolution and see them as one, as part of a shared set of liberal democratic aspirations across the world of the later 18th century.
First of all, I wouldn't equate liberalism and democracy. They mean two very different things. What's his name? The guy in 1858, Douglas. Their concept of democracy was purely within the states. So each state would have popular sovereignty to determine its own future, and that was what the Battle of Bloody Kansas was all about. I mean, democracy has got to be redefined and revolutionized. And certainly, if we conceive of democracy as a national, a national democratic dictatorship, then of course it would not tolerate, after freeing slaves, it would not tolerate any kind of resurgence of racism and no attempt to resurrect slavery.
But what people democratically wanted that?
Well, it's just like, it wouldn't happen because the democratic revolution would have to be made against all those forces. I mean, the fact that the French Revolution and abolished slavery just wasn't happenstance. It flowed from the dynamic of the French Democratic Revolution. And if the Democratic Revolution in America in the 1860s had really been carried through to fruition, then the radical Republicans would have armed the freedmen, established popular militias, crushed the Klan in embryo, established popular public schools for poor whites and poor blacks, and established a revolutionary dictatorship that was designed to prevent any kind of resurgence of slavery. And the fact that they failed to do that is why Jim Crow was able to arise so rapidly. So I think that a revolutionary dictatorship in the 1860s would have prevented any kind of racist resurgence. I mean, this liberals talk about what happens if democracy takes an illiberal turn. That's all the talk now with Orban in Hungary or Donald Trump for that matter. But of course, Donald Trump is not a product of democracy. He's a product of democratic breakdown. And the true answer, to Donald Trump is true democracy, which can only be brought by a revolutionary proletariat. Anyway, so I think that democracy is going to be conceived of as a revolutionary socialist force, and that socialism must be seen as a revolutionary democratic force, and one which fights for the full democratic rights that all socialists will do. Right?
Yeah, so Plato. I love a Plato question. So, yes, very much. I'm into Plato. For me, Platonism both falls below liberalism and exceeds it in different respects. So it falls below in the sense that it is exclusive. Plato tends to take as a premise that most people are not capable of doing philosophy, right? There's very extensive training in the Republic for what philosophers are meant to do. In a journal article I wrote called Plato as a Theorist of Legitimacy, I make this point that one of the things the philosophers have to do is make a distinction between the necessary and unnecessary desires, which they have to understand in a historical way as a category, as a boundary that shifts over time in different situations and circumstances, and they have to continuously revive it. So what the philosophers are doing is they're conceptualizing the good in different ways based on historical context, historical period. I understand that to be very, very similar to what Chris Catrone talks about when he describes different conceptualizations of freedom appropriate to different historical moments. I see a lot of commonality between the concept of freedom and the concept of the good or love in the way that they are used by many people within the Marxist tradition. And this is why Marxists so often feel they can speak in terms of higher or lower instantiations of freedom, because they have a view that certain conceptualizations are better than others, at least for particular historical moments. And I do think that Plato can be read as a historical thinker and not as someone who has a dogma, who has a fixed notion of the good or a fixed notion of what's true or what agape means or so on, that he would seek to impose. That's why the education for the Guardians in the Republic takes so long. You don't even get introduced to dialectic until you're 30. And you don't get to hold any kind of public office until you're 50 years old, because you have to spend so much time talking through what is going on, what is the situation you're in, how do these abstractions potentially apply in your time and place. So that would be my point. I think the demand for freedom that Plato had was extraordinarily high and difficult for us to fathom, because very, very few of us have access to the kinds of conditions that Greek philosophers enjoyed in terms of level of freedom, in terms of intensity and totality of freedom. Having, Aristotle praising a Theban law that says if you walk physically into the marketplace within the last 10 years, you shouldn't even participate in politics. Your presence in the agora means that you are in some way tainted by that activity, if you've done it within 10 years. And Aristotle goes, oh, this is great. This is a wonderful law. Yeah, this kind of very, very extreme commitment to freedom motivated the monks to create the monasteries, where they were extraordinarily perfectionistic about the way they scheduled their time, the way they structured their day, so that they could try to have the most profound insights possible for people. This is something that labor doesn't allow. It's something capitalism forecloses. At the same time, because they had such a very, very high standard for what constituted being a free person, it was completely unfathomable to them that it could ever be extended, and they never even thought to try, really, with very few exceptions historically. So the wonderful thing about Marxism is that there is a possibility of actually extending this and making it something that many, many more people can enjoy, and overcoming the tendency to naturalize, oh, some people can do this and some people can't, and to reify on the basis of ethnicity or nationality or racial group or sex, which Aristotle does. Aristotle's terrible about all of these things, which is why I uphold Plato is better than Aristotle's terrible about essentializing groups and essentializing the sexes and treating people badly based on where they come from. Plato is much better on all of those questions, actually. But yes, that's really where I'm coming at with the Platonism. I think that absolutely, if understood in the highest kind of way, freedom in the modern tradition and the good in the ancient tradition are almost perhaps the same idea. The difficulty is getting that across, given that very few people have enough time to read both traditions, and not even both traditions, because there are so many modern and so many ancient traditions, but to read enough of this deeply enough to see the common project, and to be able to sublate all of these different projects within the project of human emancipation, a project that we share with our ancient ancestors. We don't need to negate them.
Yeah. It seems to me that the discussion of the American Revolution per se is a historical event. First of all, is overly circumscribed, but also, and I think you hear this in comments from young people, that our impasse today is somehow the result of the revolution. And I want to say what an unsocialist position this is historically. Right? The idea that the American Revolution and the legacy of the American Revolution is what's keeping us from achieving socialism would be utterly absurd to Karl Marx, to Vladimir Lenin, to Eugene Debs, to any titanic figure that we would look to the past that actually advanced the project of socialism. Chairman Mao would say, right? It's utterly, in other words, what we're saying is that the failures of the 20th century don't have to do with the 20th century, but somehow have to do with the project of the American Revolution. It seems to me that, it's revealed by the fact of all of the half-truths and revisions that have to be undertaken by those who condemn the American Revolution. The idea that it's not for Black people or it's not for American Indians is obviously not true. As Daniel himself admitted it unleashed a wave of abolition, the first in the New World. The American Revolution didn't happen in South America. There was no such wave of abolition there, right? The fact that the question of the relationship between this expanding agricultural civilization and the hunting and gathering peoples that inhabit this hemisphere wasn't at stake in the American Revolution, wasn't at stake in the expedition of Lewis and Clark, wasn't at stake in the instructions given by Congress and by President Jefferson. The idea that the attempt to isolate it as an event, to not talk about the French Revolution in the American Revolution, which is surely what's at stake in the election of 1800, right, is the question of the French Revolution for the New World. The idea that the bourgeois revolution is about advancing the industrial revolution, or that it has to be about industrialization, immediately precludes discussion of the Dutch Revolt, of the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution, which obviously are not industrializing, but are bourgeois revolutions from any Marxist perspective. Right? Marx would talk about Cromwell and the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution within the context of the unfolding bourgeois revolution. The problem is not that bourgeois society was brought into being, right? Which is the real task of all of that's what calling it bourgeois revolution by Marxists means. It means that the task is the unleashing of bourgeois society, not democracy, the unleashing of bourgeois society. That's the issue of liberalism that James raised, right? That question has that we're going to continue to raise that issue, that we're going to continue to demand jobs, the ultimate form of bourgeois participation, right? That the principle of labor continues to be at stake, that it's at the heart of capitalism. And here's where I would agree with Ben that what we're really talking about, and I think it's at odds with his Platonism, is the deep enmeshment in history. When he said the American Revolution is all around, I would say it's also here, right? It's material, it's around the world, right? This is the Hegelian, right? The Hegelian point is that it's not a question of symbols or historical myths, right? We are trapped in this history. And what really has failed? Socialism has failed. Our task is to revitalize that project or to truly discover its limits and find a new project. Right now we can do neither. Right? The problem is not with the 18th century, right? Or Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Eugene Debs, every other significant Marxist is wrong, right? Finally, the issue of the American Revolution per se, in the project, in trying to revitalize the project of socialism, it is not true that you won't find people who are concerned with the American Revolution in Kerala or in the Philippines. Where do you think the communists of Kerala come to get their education? Right? I know lots of them. I went to graduate school with them. Right? It's not that they were educated, that they're like sons of the soil. They were educated at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or Yale or somewhere else. Right? And there is an intellectual leadership in Kerala. It's not just a movement of the people, right? There's a real project of communism there. And the same is true in the Philippines and elsewhere. And they know that there's something about the legacy, that these institutions that exist in the first world that is closely tied to the destiny of world history, right? The fact of the matter is that socialism reached its apex as a struggle in Europe. And America took on, in the wake of its ruin, the reorganization of society globally. Very reluctantly in 1945. And what happened in 1945? Ho Chi Minh got up and read the Declaration of Independence in Vietnamese. Right? It's of course a legacy after 1945. And why has socialism failed in America since 1945? It wasn't destroyed by Hitler.
Right? This is a real question. Right? To which I assure you, voting for Kamala Harris is no answer. Right? In fact, it's the opposite of an answer to that question. Right? It's been the opposite of the answer since 1945. So young people, do not listen to these stories about these aging new leftists who blame the failure to rekindle the project of socialism in the United States in the 60s and 70s on the 18th century. It's false. It's a lie. Right? We live in the aftermath of 20th century failure. Right? And we're still going to be struggling for private property in our person. We're still going to be struggling for labor, right? And that's where I think the Platonism and the Hegelianism, the echoes of Hegelianism are really at odds, right? I don't think we're going to overcome the dialectic of labor until we realize it.
I'll speak closing remarks as well.
Yeah. Oh, okay, closing remarks. Yeah, so for one, I want to make it clear, Platonism is very material. There's a stereotype of Plato as an idealist who rejects the material. This is not the case. A major part of Platonism is theurgy, and theurgic virtue is the highest kind of virtue in the Platonic tradition, even exceeding philosophical virtue. It comes very much into the tradition through Iamblichus, but is present in many Platonists of many different religious denominations, affiliations. You don't have to be sectarian about it. But what theurgy is really about is about the construction of rituals, habits, built environments, physical spaces, moments, events that activate consciousness or help people to grasp things that they previously haven't grasped. It's the ability to come back into the cave and give pedagogy to someone who has not come out, effective pedagogy. It's an attempt to try to make a science of that, really, at its core. And it very much is focused on the way the city is constructed, the kind of educational environment you have, the school of rhetoric as opposed to other kinds of schools you might potentially establish. All of these things have something to do with human consciousness, and they are built and they are physical. So I firmly agree that the American Revolution is also here physically, very much so. And the task of the philosopher is to intervene in the physical on the basis of some understanding of how those interventions contribute to unlocking consciousness going forward. Unlocking consciousness means that we should be making interventions thinking that those who come after us might be able to see more than we see, or at the very least that they might be able to see at least as well. And that means training people to be able to think rather than to agree with us. One of the major problems in every tradition, modern and ancient, is dogmatists who try to make people agree with their view instead of teaching them how to think, and who call this education. And you see it in the university, but you also see it among autodidacts and on YouTube channels and in other places too. It's not a uniquely university problem. People who give speeches and want to be clapped, who want recognition or who want a position or who want money. And some people who mean very well, but have never really had the time themselves to develop to the point at which they can make this kind of intervention effectively. And many, many people are very, very capable thinkers on a philosophical or theoretical level. They have loads of theoretical virtue. But when it comes time to do pedagogy, when it comes time to teach someone else how to follow them, they fall short because they don't know how to make an institution. They don't know how to make a built environment. They can't construct a conversation, which is a physical process, not just a question of ideas or symbols or signs. It involves dealing with the body and the way the body affects us, coming back into that for the right kind of purpose. So I very much agree with the point that Spencer's making. But what I would say is that so often the ancients are accused of having missed things that they put into different kinds of words, that they expressed in different ways, in different environments. And much of what the ancients thought about this stuff, they felt it was inappropriate to write down because they thought someone at an insufficiently developed level might pick it up and read it, and they might misunderstand it and make a stupid dogma out of it. And if that hasn't happened with Marxism over and over and over again, I don't know with what tradition it's happened with more. And the problem is that many, many Marxists, while they have
revolutionary tradition.
Yeah,
It's happened more than anything.
Yes, and the liberal tradition, all of the modern traditions. in their connections and in their separateness. They've all been dogmatized repeatedly because a lot of people have theoretical virtue, but they don't have theurgic virtue. They don't know how to teach. And when they have an opportunity to teach young people, they go, I will succeed if I can make them agree with my view which comes out of my own life experience and my own situation. And if I can trap them in my historical moment, I will have accomplished something. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so that's why I very much think that you can and should uphold Platonism and Marxism together. And I'll end there.
First of all, thank you so much to all three panelists. I really actually have learned a lot from all of you, so I really appreciate it. I think I actually watched in preparation for today. Last night I watched my favorite movie and my favorite musical, 1776. It's brilliant, and I think that and I remember I saw that movie first as a teenager in England during the bicentennial, and the BBC was doing a lot of American programming, and they actually showed it. And I actually only was able to see half of it because I had to go to bed. My parents wouldn't let me stay up late, so it was about 20 years later until I actually saw the whole thing. But anyway, and I think that what sort of struck me about like comparing 1776 to Hamilton is that so much of this is about identity and I think the reason that we're sort of so intense about this is that in some sense, in arguing about 1776 and in arguing about the American Revolution, the Constitution, so on, and history, we're actually arguing about who we are and who we want to be. And I think that's whether we want to basically affirm as radicals, as socialists, we want to be American socialists, we want to be American radicals, or do we want to do we feel a need to basically disavow that? And I think that's part of what's at stake and why it's so intense.
All right, Spencer. First of all, Marxism is a science of historical materialism. So history is relevant, all aspects of history. Trotsky, Lenin, wrestled with the legacy of Tsarism. Trotsky wrestled with the peculiarities of Russian development. Trotsky wrote about Cromwell. By the way, your point is well taken about bourgeois revolutions not being limited to the French Revolution, but the French Revolution is the classic bourgeois revolution. But as to all history, no, the Civil War was.
I mean, it's the last until 1848 and
1865,
Paris Commune,
1917.
1917,
Right.
was also a bourgeois revolution.
Well, but all history is relevant. All history weighs on us. The idea is not to simply surrender to history or blame history. The idea is to use history to arm a working class movement. But the fact is, in America, we live under an 18th century constitution. A constitution which resembles the political structure of 1787 Belgium much more than it does any kind of modern democracy. We have weighted voting. We have all kinds of intermediary bodies, electoral colleges, Supreme Courts, a Senate, which is an atrocity.
These are altered by a 19th century amendment.
No, in fact, it's that the Senate has never been more unrepresentative at any point. It's actually getting worse. The Electoral College has given us 2 unelected presidents. The Electoral College has given us 2 unelected presidents in the last 25 years. Previously, the only example was 1876 and also 1800 as well. But the, and also 18, 20. This problem is growing. The Constitution is reverting, it's dragging America backward, and it's an 18th century Constitution. Now, we can't blame the failure of socialism on that, but that certainly is a problem that any socialist movement must grapple with in a revolutionary way. If it tries to avoid it, evade it, it's going to get nowhere. So this is the problem the proletariat faces: how to democratize this increasingly dysfunctional, undemocratic society. The same problem that Lenin and Trotsky wrestled with in dealing with Tsarism. So it's the 18th century has never been more relevant than it is now.
EGFs lived in the memory of the total revolutionary transformation of the Constitution in the wake of the Civil War. Right?
It wasn't total. It was not
He knew
total.
that the 13th.
If it was total, the slaves the black people would have been free. It was not total.
If the
It was one step forward,
past
two steps
had been
back.
socialism, then that could have been passed just as surely as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were. He didn't see the non-amendability of the Constitution.
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were forced bills imposed by law. The Article 5 was stretched to the breaking point. It was not the irony is the Civil War amendments are unconstitutional. That is the.
Relevant to the 18th century Constitution, since we've amended it on an unconstitutional basis.
No, it's not the current 18th century Constitution. It's an unconstitutional Constitution. That's what he just said.
Cool. So, all right, okay. Now I gotta moderate. Believe it or not, I have to moderate. Dan, please. Now I have to moderate. Okay, so just closing remarks. Hopefully the frustration of the conversation will lead to further things, but no, Dan, I wanted you to finish. I just don't. But
To say the constitutional amendments were unconstitutional is that America labors under grave contradictions. And those were forced bills. As I said, are the Article 5, the amending clause, was stretched to the breaking point in order to impose those amendments. Now, you can't have a constitutional amendment imposing socialism. It simply is impossible for about 1,001 reasons. You have to have a clean break with the past. You've got to overthrow this republic and put a new workers' republic in its place, one which understands democracy in completely different ways, not which tries to build on the American Revolution or carry it forward or which sees a smooth marriage, but one which creates a rupture in the historical tradition and overthrows one republic and replaces it with another.
okay, over to you.
I think I love you.
All right. Yeah, I've really been pleasantly surprised at how that there seems to be no pattern about the things that we end up agreeing and disagreeing on. It's just, I like you a lot. You're a very interesting person. All right. I'm gonna wrap this up really quick because I have a personal emergency to deal with. But we came here to talk about the legacy of 1776, and I think I landed on my closing remarks while I was talking earlier. We can go on and investigate the details of the history as deeply as we want, but if that conversation has nothing to do with what are the operative questions of seizing state power, what is the blueprint of a workers' republic? Do we have any suitable blueprints, or is that on our homework list of something we have to do on our own? If the conversations we have about the legacy of revolution have nothing to do about the revolution today that we have to carry out, they are useless, sophistry-laden conversations that do nobody any good. The real question for today is building the workers' republic. How is that to be done? The extended question is, what does 1776 and its experience have to lend to that task? That's the conversation that going into the future that I'm most interested in having. I'm going to make sure that I do what I have to make sure that when I spend time, of which I only have a finite amount, thinking about the American Revolution, that I am making sure to reintroduce the focus on today's political task, building the workers' republic. So I like to tell people that the only acceptable balance of power is workers having all of it, and the only conversation I'm truly interested in having is making that happen.
Please give our panelists.
Real quick before everyone gets up, this conversation can continue no matter your views on the American Revolution at Hopewell Bar and Kitchen. Hopewell, you can get there directly on the Green Line. It's like 30 minutes. But people with cars, please take some people. So if you want to ride, try to pair up. And also tomorrow we start at 10 a.m. in Boston Common. So join us there.
Boy, you're kind of putting